Reformation 1560. So it was a bit later, but our Reformation was far more reformed. So the Scottish Church was reformed later, but it was a more reformed church with all the idols taken out of the church, all the stained glass windows taken out. The stained glass window you see in here is Victorian at the earliest. The rest of it was gone. So, as I said, our Reformation was more thorough than England's. So, as I said, England, they still kept all the bishops and archbishops and sort of similar things, even crucifixes in churches. Scotland, completely different. So I'll just set the background for the Reformation, and then we'll see a little bit inside here, and we'll go out into the city and see some stuff as well. So Scotland prior to the Reformation, very spiritually dark land. All worship services were in Latin. There was a lot of superstition in the church, a lot of corruption in the church. But not long after Martin Luther had his Reformation over in Germany, it started to make its way towards Scotland. 1528, a young man called Patrick Hamilton, he's from a noble family. He's over studying in France, and he's converted, and he comes back to Scotland with the gospel. He starts to preach. He's arrested at St Andrews and burned at the stake in 1528, 29th of February 1528. He was the very first martyr for the Reformation in Scotland. So it's only 11 years after Martin Luther, 1517 with Martin Luther, 1528, the Reformation starts. But after his death, more and more people were being converted because gospel tracts were being smuggled up into Scotland. England had its Reformation by this point, so they were being smuggled up from England. They were brought in ships. Laws were passed making it illegal to try and smuggle Luther's pamphlets in, or even Bibles in your own language. So when they did that, it was causing all sorts of trouble. But God was still working. More and more people were being converted, but the Catholic Church was trying to suppress it. Outside Edinburgh Castle, there was 5 people burned at the stake. One day, up in Perth, 4 men hanged, a woman sealed inside a barrel, thrown in the river for being a Protestant. Same in Glasgow, people burned at the stake in Glasgow. So as the Reformation is growing, the Catholic Church is just trying to suppress it. But God was working, behind the scenes. And he was always raising up somebody to carry on the work of Reformation. The next man after Patrick Hamilton, the first martyr that God raised up, was a young man called George Wishart. George Wishart travelled round preaching the gospel. There was a couple of assassination attempts on his life. Down in the southwest of Scotland, like Ayrshire, Lanarkshire, thousands of people came to hear him preach. Through here in the east of Scotland, not too many. People were frightened because if you went to listen to him preach, you could be punished with death. So the people were scared, and he was a bit disheartened when he was through in the east. He goes and stays with a man who's a landowner. It's not a nobleman, but he's a laird, which means he's got land and he's quite wealthy. And he's a Protestant. He's given George Wishart shelter before. So George Wishart goes there, and he goes in, and there's another man there who staying with this man. And George Wishart asks the laird, who's this guy? And the laird says, that's John Knox. He's the personal tutor to my family, to my children. Knox had originally been in training to be a priest in the Catholic Church at St Andrews, but he got a job as a solicitor for the Catholic Church, looking after legal documents. But he saw the corruption in the church at that time, and he left, and he was converted. He was a Protestant. So him and Wishart become close friends. John Knox, basically George Wishart becomes his teacher. It really helps Knox to grow in his faith. When it's time for George Wishart to leave, John Knox says, I'm coming with you, let me grab my sword. And John Knox becomes George Wishart's bodyguard. When George Wishart's preaching, sometimes John Knox is standing at the bottom of the pulpit with a 2-handed sword to protect him in the pulpit. But eventually George Wishart is arrested. He's taken to St Andrews and he's burned at the stake in 1546. So he's burned as well. But by this time, there was a number of Protestants in Scotland who wanted to get revenge for this. So the man who killed George Wishart was a man called Cardinal David Beaton. He's living in the castle of St Andrews. Some Protestants make their way inside the castle. They take control of the castle. They kill Cardinal Beaton and then barricade themselves inside because they know they're in trouble. So these Protestants are inside the castle of St Andrews. They send a letter down to Henry VIII, who's a Protestant in England, and say, look, we want to make Scotland Protestant. Do you want to give us some help? Henry VIII isn't interested, not his problem. So they're sitting in the castle, and they look out one day and they see ships approaching St Andrews. It's right on the coast. The castle's right on top of the cliffs at the coast. And they can see ships approaching, but it's not English ships that they hoped for. It was actually French warships. The person in control of Scotland at that time is technically Mary Queen of Scots, but she's just a child still. So her mother, Mary of Guise, Marie de Guise, very powerful French family, Catholic family, she's looking after Scotland till her daughter grows up. And she doesn't want these Protestants getting a foothold. So she sends off to Catholic France for help, and these French come and lay siege to the castle. Whilst there's a lull in the siege, there's a bit of a ceasefire for a little bit. John Knox makes his way through and joins those other Protestants inside the castle. But then the siege continues. But inside the castle is when John Knox is called to the ministry. People realise that God has given this man a gift. You know, he can speak and he can preach, because he preached a couple of times in there, and they decided they were going to call him to the ministry. Knox had no idea what was going to happen, so there's a castle chaplain who's preaching a sermon on being called to the ministry. The people are there, Knox is there, he thinks it's a good sermon, but at the end of it, they all turn to Knox and say, we want you to be our minister. And he's a bit shocked at this, so he runs out in tears, but he comes back the next day and he accepts the job of being the minister of the very first Protestant congregation in Scotland. So Knox is called to the ministry of the first Protestant congregation in Scotland, whilst inside the castle with French cannons shooting at the castle. But eventually the siege ends and they all surrender. They come out. Knox is chained up as a galley slave on board a French warship, and he has to row between France and Scotland many, many times. For almost 19 months, he's chained to an oar, literally tied to an oar, having to row. But he gets released because down in England, Henry VIII has died, and his young son Edward is on the throne, and he's more strong in his Protestant faith. He's just a young king, but he's strong in his faith, and he manages to do a prisoner swap, release French Catholics from England. France releases English and Scottish Protestants, including Knox. Now, so Knox is freed, can't come back to Scotland, still a separate country, and Scotland still Catholic. So he stays in England, first up in the north, right, a town called Berwick-upon-Tweed, then down into Newcastle. He becomes the minister there, and then the young King Edward tells him to come to London and preach to the king, become a royal chaplain, and he goes down there, preaches to the king. Sadly, that young king dies just before his 16th birthday, and his sister, Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, as history would call her, she comes on the throne, and she's Catholic. She has a counter-reformation. There's almost 300 Protestants burned at the stake down in England during her reign, and there's a whole exodus of Protestants out. John Knox is told by his friends, get out, and he does. He's reluctant, he doesn't want to go, but he knows he'll be burned at the stake. So he leaves England, goes over to the continent, makes his way down to Geneva, meets John Calvin. There's a whole bunch of English refugees down there. Knox becomes their minister to the Scottish congregation down there. Back in Scotland, however, the French are still here, the French army is still here to make sure Protestants don't rise up, and they've been treating the people pretty badly. By this time, whilst Knox is over in Geneva, a number of the nobles have started to convert to the Protestant faith, and they decide they want to get the French out and they want a Reformation. So they raise an army. They're called the Lords of the Congregation, these nobles. They raise an army, but they need a leader. So they say to John Knox, come and lead us in Reformation. They send a letter over to Geneva to Knox to say, look, come and help us. Which Knox is reluctant at the start. But whilst this is going on, down in England, Bloody Mary dies and Elizabeth I comes on the throne. She's Protestant. So England's Protestant again, and it's safe for Protestants there. So Knox's congregation don't need to stay in Geneva. They're starting to dwindle, head back. So Knox accepts this letter to come and help the Reformation, and he comes back to Scotland, and they raise an army. They drive the French down to Leith. Eventually, they're up in Perth first of all, then they go over to Stirling, but eventually they drive the French army back to outside Leith, and there's a siege. Leith's just a town, a suburb of Edinburgh now, but it was a separate town at that time, and the Protestants, Scottish Protestants, lay siege whilst the French are behind it. They send a letter, they can't get the French out, but they send a letter down to Elizabeth I and said, could you supply English troops and weapons to help us? And she does. She sends troops up. So you've got a combined Protestant force of Scottish Protestants, English Protestants. Elizabeth I cuts off the channel so that French reinforcements can't come up. So that helps. Marie de Guise, Mary Queen of Scots' mother, she's up in the castle of Edinburgh. She's sent her daughter over to France to get away from it all, grow up in the French court. Plan is to marry the French prince. So Mary of Guise is up in the castle. She dies in June 1560, and the French lose the will to stay and fight. They know there's no reinforcements coming, so they sign a treaty and they leave, and that's it. The nation's ready for Reformation, and under John Knox's leadership, the whole nation changes from a Roman Catholic country to a Protestant country towards the end of 1560. And Knox comes here. This is his church. He becomes the minister here after the Reformation of the first, well, a lot of people call it the mother church of Presbyterians. So Presbyterians from all over the world come here because it's really the first Presbyterian church in the world. And Knox comes here. And he's here from 1560 right through to 1572 when he dies. And he's buried outside, which I'll take you around and show you his grave in a second. I'm going to show you a couple of things as we walk around here. That's just a brief overview. We're going to go to see something about the Second Reformation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Covenanters. But that's a big important part, because that's only one part of the Reformation. We'll have to go through a whole second Reformation. Because 1560, John Knox is obviously the Reformation's complete. She's a widow. She'd married the French prince, but he died and she was a widow at 18. She's still technically Queen of Scotland, so she comes back to Scotland and takes up the throne, a Catholic queen of a Protestant country. So it causes a lot of suspicion with the Scottish people, because Mary got plans to take Scotland, undo the Reformation, and it's just happened. Knox meets with her down at Holyrood Palace, and they have debates and talks, and so not always very.
Is that when? Sorry to interrupt you. Is that when Knox married his second wife after his first one married?
Yes, his first wife died.
Yeah.
He did remarry.
They were both English or Scottish?
Both Scottish. Yeah.
Both Scottish.
Marjorie Bowes, he met his wife in England, technically. It was Berwick upon Tweed, which is just right on the border. So when he moved up there, that's where he met his wife. So Knox, he goes down and meets Mary Queen of Scots, tries to tell her the errors of Rome. She says she fears the massed armies of Europe far less than the prayers and speeches of Mr. John Knox, because it always end up a fight. Anyway, Mary Queen of Scots, there's a lot of scandal in her life. She brings back an Italian secretary. People think he's a spy for the Pope. She remarries a man called Lord Darnley. He's suspicious of this Italian secretary, David Rizzio, that Mary Queen of Scots, Lord Darnley, her husband, has David Rizzio killed, stabbed 50 odd times in front of Mary Queen of Scots. He didn't do it himself, but got other people to burst into the chamber and do it. So Mary Queen of Scots is heartbroken at this, and she basically has her husband killed, Lord Darnley. She's at a party, he's at home, one of his houses in Edinburgh. It blows up, and he's found being suffocated. It wasn't actually the explosion that killed him. He was found with suffocation marks on him. So, but by this time, Mary Queen of Scots has given birth to their son, who would be the future King James. So she's, obviously people say, we don't like this queen, she needs to go. So she's arrested on suspicion of killing her husband, and she's held up in a little castle, a place called Loch Leven Castle, and she escapes, tries to raise a Protestant army in 1567, but she's defeated just outside Glasgow by Scottish Protestants, and she escapes down to England, and Elizabeth I takes her in, puts her under house arrest, but she's there for many years, does eventually get her head chopped off, and she puts her name to a plot to overthrow Elizabeth. But up in Scotland, young King James becomes king at just 1 year of age, so he's just a baby. Obviously, you can't run a country when you're just a 1 year old. John Knox preaches at his coronation up in Stirling, the Church of the Holy Rood in Stirling. So King James is king of Scotland, just a baby. So there's a series of regents who are ruling in his place, some nobles who are looking after the country until he's old enough. One of them is this man inside here. See here, James, Earl of Murray, regent of Scotland. That's the old part there, 1570. So he's known as the Good Regent. He's a Protestant. He's looking after the country until King James gets a bit older. 1570, he's travelling through the town of Linlithgow, and there's still a number of Mary's supporters in Scotland, Catholics. One of them, a man called James Hamilton, he is hiding in the window, and he sees the regent going past, he shoots him and kills him. And you can actually see, if you come over here, you can see the top part of the stained glass window is his assassination. So he's on his horse and he's been shot. And if you go up to the top to the left hand side, you'll see the musket coming out the window. Now, if you read the history books, they'll tell you that this is the very first assassination by a firearm ever recorded in the history books. And it happened here in Scotland, part of the Reformation. So the Protestant regent's shot by a Catholic supporter of Mary. This is John Knox preaching at his funeral inside St Giles here, and then he's buried inside here. So that's 1570. The following year, 1571, a whole bunch of Mary's Catholic supporters castle and hold it for 2 years in Mary's name. And it's right at this point when John Knox dies. So he dies in 1572. So when Knox dies, he's struggled and made the Reformation happen. But when he dies, it looks as if it's about to be undone. The Protestant regent's been shot. Mary's Catholic supporters have got control of the castle. There's a siege that's going on. Knox dies. So it's very sad that when he dies, he doesn't die with the peace and assurance that he's left Scotland safe in his hands. You can actually look over here. This is Knox's old gravestone, the original grave marker. And we're going to show you his grave outside, but this is the old one, Jonas Knox, in 1572. What is the grave? This. So, 1560, the Reformation happens. Knox dies in 1572. King James, when he's getting a bit older, the country's Presbyterian. He's not too keen on the Presbyterian Church. So, he because he's got no control of it, in the Presbyterian Church, Christ is head of the church, not the king, not like England. So King James, when he's getting older, wants to make the church Anglican so that he can have control over it. And he struggles all the way through the 1580s, 1590s, and into the 1600s. In 1603, Elizabeth I dies with no children. So the throne passes to the Scottish king, King James. So King James VI of Scotland in 1603 becomes King James I of England. So basically the Scottish king moves into London, becomes king of two separate countries, but will become like a united kingdom. Still separate countries, but one monarch for the two of them. And this is when he forces the church to be episcopal. He forces the bishops on the Scottish church. In 1618, he draws things up called the 5 Articles of Perth, which means kneeling for communion, confirmation by bishops, observance of saints' days and holy days. Everything that the people in Scotland think we're moving back towards Roman Catholicism. We've had the Reformation, now we're moving back. He goes so far, but in 1625 he dies and his son Charles I takes over. He thinks of the high Anglican church system right, and he forces even more rules and sort of ceremonies on the Scottish church, which the people just don't want. Things come to a head in 1637 inside this building here. A new prayer book, an English-style prayer book, has been told to be read out and used by the Scottish Church here in Scotland. The Dean reads it out now. The Scots are not objecting to a prayer book, they've had them before. But this one, when you see it, very Roman Catholic. There's prayers to Mary in it, there's prayers to saints and all sorts of things. So when it's read out for the first time inside here, a market trader woman called Jenny Geddes stands up, picks up her little stool that she's sitting on. She accuses him of saying the Roman Catholic Mass, and she throws the stool towards his head. Of course, the Dean ducks and the stool goes flying past. But when he stands up, everybody's stool comes flying towards him, and there's a huge riot inside this building. It's called the Prayer Book Riots, spread across Scotland throughout the summer of 1637. This is the start of the Second Reformation. here in Scotland. And people say, enough's enough. And they tell the king, stay out the church. And they tell people, the two men, a lawyer called Archibald Johnson and a minister called Alexander Henderson, both Presbyterians, both leaders in the church, they say to them to draw up a declaration to tell the king, stay out the church. And that's what this is. This is it here. It's called the National Covenant. Now, it's in 3 sections. The first part is a little promise that was the king signed in 1580, the previous king, King James. There was a bit concern about Roman Catholic influence in King James in 1580. So a minister called John Craig drew up a declaration for the king to sign to say he'll defend the Protestant faith. So they brought it out in 1638 again, put that at the first part. There's a middle section listing all the acts of Parliament and laws in favour of the Reformed faith to say to the king, look, your father promised to keep the church Presbyterian, Protestant. This is the law of the land. Just because you're the king, you can't change the law of the land. And then there's a part at the bottom where they promise to defend themselves. They're saying, but this isn't a declaration of war or anything. We're trying to get the king to see sense, but we will defend ourselves. We're reunited. We're putting, basically, God comes before everything, God's word, and Christ as head of the church comes before everything. We'll be the king's most loyal subjects as long as he stays out the church.
Is that why when King Charles was appointed, he also had to plead loyalty to the Protestant Church of Scotland or protect it? Or
yes. What you're talking about?
Yeah.
That King Charles today?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that comes at the end of this. When the Reformation ends, there's a law put in place to make sure that when this Second Reformation ends, there's laws put in place to make sure that the monarch doesn't interfere with the Scottish Church. Because of this, they're saying, look, we've had all this. Because the people who signed this, you can see the signatures here. That's just from one town, one small village. Every town and village in Scotland got their own copy for the people to sign. People signed this in their own blood. And people who signed this later on, as you'll see as we walk around the city, thousands of people were martyred for their faith because of this. So once that persecution ended, there was
there more martyrs in Scotland than the rest of England? Or it sounds
during,
like
during
it.
the Second Reformation, yeah. It's an estimated 18,000. I'll show you. I'm going to show you today a mass grave of over 100 martyrs. So, and it tells you on the monument there, estimated 18,000 throughout Scotland during this Second Reformation time. So, but this is a national covenant. So when you hear me talking about people who are called covenanters, now that's what the Protestants of the Second Reformation were called, because they signed this here. But this is original from 1638. It is like a little memorial to Jenny Geddes. So following the 1603 union of the crowns, Scotland and England began to share the same monarch, though the two countries were still independent kingdoms. In 1637, King Charles attempted to draw the Scottish Church, which was Presbyterian, into line with the English Church, which was Anglican, and it caused widespread discontent because of Scotland's independent church system, which was established in 1560. Then, as you see, as soon as it was read out, this woman in here, through the stool, started the Second Reformation. And this is just a memorial to Jenny Geddes. So what's your own background? You Presbyterian?
No. Pentecostal, okay. Protestant. Yeah. What about you?
You're Presbyterian.
Presbyterian, yeah.
Reformed Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Reformed Presbyterian.
Yeah. Is that Calvinism as well? Reformed Calvinism.
Yeah. Yep.
And do you guys read the ESV translation? Or?
ESV. Yes, that's what we use in our church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see.
Which one? So you can see here, Archibald Campbell, Marquis of Argyll, beheaded near this cathedral, 1661, leader and counsellor in the field for the Reformed religion. So with the Scots rose up with the Second Reformation, with the riots starting here, the people sign the National Covenant. Charles I down in England, who's he's just ruling completely. He says it's called the King's personal rule. Doesn't need Parliament. The King's he believes in the divine right of kings, and he is ruling completely. So when the Scots have this riot, he has to get money. He wants to raise an army to come and fight the Scots. So he says to them, to Parliament, come back, give me money, I'm going to go and fight these rebellious Scots who don't want me as head of the church. The English Parliament, which is mostly filled with Puritans, they think what the Scots have done is a good thing, because they want to purify the church in England. They don't like all the ceremonies and things that's in the church. So they say, no, we're not going to give you money to fight the Scots. So it's known as the Short Parliament. The king gets rid of it, don't give him money. But it causes all sorts of trouble for the king. He does raise his own army with his own money and brings them up towards Scotland. But the Scottish Protestants, these Presbyterians, they raise their own army and they go down to the border. So when the king's army comes up, looks over the border, sees 20,000 Scottish Presbyterians, very heavily armed with muskets, and a new blue banner that says "For Christ's Crown and Covenant" on it in gold writing with a blue background. 20,000 men also singing psalms. They conceded determination, and the king's army says no chance, and they actually just turn and retreat. The king has to sign a treaty saying, okay, we'll leave the church as it is, but behind the scenes he's trying to bring over Irish Catholics to invade Scotland, and he recalls Parliament again and ends up a whole bunch of trouble between him and Parliament. It leads to the English Civil War, and the English Civil War kicks off in the 1640s. So the kings, nobody's really winning the English Civil War at the start. Both are pretty evenly matched. Both sides look to Scotland for help. The king says, I'm still your king, come and help me. The parliamentarians say, look, you Presbyterians, come and help me, us. He says, we want to reform the church in England. So we'll have one nice uniformed, reformed church between Scotland, England and Ireland. And that seems a better option for the Scots. So they actually sign a treaty called the Solemn League and Covenant, 1643, and they give we'll give you military help, English parliamentarians, in exchange for church reforms. And I don't know if you've ever heard of something called the Westminster Confession of Faith. There's something called the 1640s. That's what most Reformed and Presbyterian churches, not just Scotland but throughout the world, would that's the standards it would hold to. That's their confession of faith. It was written at this time, and it just basically bound the English church and the Scottish church as one Reformed church. That was the plan, anyway. The king is defeated because the Scots go over the border and help the English parliamentarians. He's defeated at Marston. King's arrested. He actually surrenders to the Scots, who hand him over to the English parliamentarians, and he's eventually beheaded. And Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Presbyterians. Right through the 1650s is when Cromwell rules. Not just England, but Scotland as well. Lord High Protector. It's the only time the two countries haven't had a monarch. It's during the 1650s. But a lot of people up in Scotland are not too happy at that, even the Presbyterians, because they wanted to teach the king a lesson. But the English parliamentarians chopped his head off. Never told the Scots that's what they were going to do. Says, you should have told us. And Scots thought, okay, well, his son, Charles II, is over on the continent. He says to the Scottish Presbyterians, make me King of Scotland, and I'll sign the covenant. I'll keep Scotland Presbyterian, and if I get King of England, I'll make the same as well. So he comes over, signs the covenant in 1650, and he has a coronation up in Perth, in a city just north of Edinburgh, up towards the Highlands. So he's crowned, but it doesn't work out because they try and raise an army and then Cromwell invades and defeats them. So he escapes back out of Scotland again, the king, and he's over in exile, and Cromwell rules. But Cromwell dies in 1658, and nobody really knows who's going to rule. His son Richard tries to rule, but he's not a good leader. So people don't know what to do. So even in England they say, we need to bring back the king, Charles II, and they offer him the throne in 1660. It's known as the restoration of the monarchy. And 1660 he comes in, and he goes down to London, huge fanfare. People are falling over themselves to just try and get favour with the king. This man, who put the crown on his head up in Perth, he actually crowned the king when he came over in 1650 after signing the covenant. He goes down to meet the king and says, great, you're back. Remember your obligations, what you promised for Scotland. You signed the covenant, says you will keep Scotland Presbyterian and do the same in England. The king has him arrested, put in the Tower of London, brought up to Edinburgh and beheaded in 1661. You can see here, beheaded near this cathedral, 1661. Leader in council and in field for the Reformed religion. Some of his last words were, I set the crown on the king's head. He hastens me to a better crown than his own. And then you've got the covenantal motto for Christ's crown and covenant underneath it. And here it says, he has made with me an everlasting covenant. The most powerful noble family in Scotland. Even today, there's a castle called Inveraray Castle, and his ancestor, the Duke, still lives in Inveraray Castle. Argyll Shire is a huge area. But this family, even way back at the beginning of the Reformation with Knox, they let Knox preach inside their castle. They embraced the Reformation. They helped translate the Bible into Gaelic, so that the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders could get access to God's word as well. So a very powerful noble family who were really instrumental in the Reformation. And he becomes the first of those 18,000 martyrs I was telling you about. He's the very first to be executed. Okay, just go back. There's a one-way system. Should have been done that way, but it wasn't too busy, so
Yeah.
we'll be going that way.
Right.
So you can see over here on the ground, John Knox's grave. So Knox is minister here from 1560 right through to 1572, and he dies, and he's buried here, which is a car park now, but it wasn't a car park back then. This was the cemetery for St Giles Cathedral. In the 1600s, they wanted to build a new hall for the Scottish Parliament, so they built a new hall here, behind that false wall. You can see here. It looks like those are just painted on windows. They just wanted that side to look like that side when they built it in the 1700s. So behind there's the old Parliament building, which is still intact. It's now the Supreme Courts. It's the highest court in the land of Scotland. So they moved some of the headstones and some of the bodies from over there, but they left the rest of the bodies here. So Knox is still buried here, along with thousands of other people who's all.
Is this the Martyrs burial?
No, this is just Knox. No, I'm going to. That's over in another cemetery.
Yeah.
We're going to see. So you can see how Knox is grave is. Sometimes there's a car parked on it, so you've got to look under the car to see it. And then compare it to this statue here. Which is the oldest statue in Edinburgh. Dates from the 1680s, and it's Charles II. This is the king who you're going to see during this Second Reformation. He's just beheaded the man who put the crown on his head. He forces bishops on the Scottish Church in 1682, and he tells all the Scottish Presbyterian ministers they must come under control of his bishops. Over 300 people, ministers refuse, and they're initially, they get kicked out of their churches, so they go out into the fields and preach out in the fields, and local people just go to listen to them. All the empty churches are filled by the king's curates, but people don't go to the king's churches, they just go and listen to these, to their own faithful Presbyterian ministers. It initially becomes punishable by fines that the king starts, then it becomes punishable by death to preach out in the fields, then it becomes punishable by death to even listen to these ministers preaching in the field. So as you'll see, thousands of people during this period of the Second Reformation, thousands of them, 18,000 estimate, are martyred, killed, some in battle, some just shot, hanged, drowned, all over the place. And this is the king that's behind it. This is the man that's got the blood of all those people on his hands. And you can see how that statue, the king had this made for himself. Charles II had it made for himself.
Looks a bit like Caesar.
Yeah, I think that's what he's going for.
Yeah.
You know, sort of Roman emperor figure.
Or Nero.
Yeah, and then you've got Knox's grave, which is a car park. Car parking space. We'll just walk round just to the front of the building. So inside that building as I said, that's where the trials of all these people, if they were arrested for listening to these ministers preaching out in the fields, even the ministers were taken inside this building here and tortured inside there, either with the thumb screw, which is a vice they put your thumb in, or something called the boot, which is a brace down the bottom of your leg, and it's basically hammer wedges down it to crush your leg and just try and get information from you. Who was the minister? Who was preaching there? Which one of your friends was there? Because the king passes a law that it's illegal to have prayer meetings in your house. It's illegal to have, worship services anywhere but the king's churches. So you can see just how bad it was. I want to show you this here. It's different plates on the ground, different dates on it, but going way back to 1386. And if you follow the brass plates here, they go down behind you, and then they continue along here, all the way down, and then go down the centre of the road. You can see them in the centre of the road there. It shows you the outline of a large building here. This is a big space now, but it would have just been a narrow alleyway there, and the same on the other side, because there was a huge building here called the toll booth, which was basically the council offices, but it's also where the local jail was as well, the prison. So, as I said, 62, the king tells all these people to come under control of the bishops, and many hundreds of them don't. So people are listening to these ministers, and fines, and then imprisonment, banishment. Some of them sold to the plantations as slaves. Many of them just executed. But this is where a lot of them were held. Here, you can see the heart shape on the ground. That's where the prison was. They were held there, taken inside that building and tortured, then taken down to the Grassmarket and executed, which will go down and see there. But this is where they were held. This your first time in Edinburgh?
Yeah, this time.
Let's just very quickly just show you something here. Show you this. This is an original Gutenberg Bible. One of only 49 copies of Gutenberg's Bible known to exist, and only 21 are complete. And this is the library's copy. So this is the man who invented the printing press. Just before the Reformation, mid-1400s, mass produces the Bible, which brings down the price of getting a Bible. Because before this, everything had to be handwritten. All of a sudden you can mass produce them relatively quickly, so the prices come down, and it makes getting access to a Bible easier. Also, if it wasn't for him inventing the printing press, Reformation, even with Martin Luther, would be very difficult. But because this had been invented just before it, Martin Luther's all his pamphlets and all these things were mass produced and spread out, and it helped to spread the Reformation across Europe. But as I said, look how. What I'll maybe do, actually, just check the time, is we'll go to the museum first, because it's late in the afternoon. They might close.
Okay.
They probably will be closed by the time we go down the other way. Do you want to get a drink or something, Sean?
No, I'm alright, thanks.
When we do our English Reformation tour, we start, we go down to Carlisle, we stop off at Carlisle Cathedral and things, then we go down to Chester, and Martyrs burned at the stake there, we actually go into Chester Cathedral and see the chair where they sat on for the trials.
Wow.
Then we go down to down to Oxford, London, then up to Cambridge, York, and back up. So One second, that's the old church. If you look over here, you can see gold things, which would have sat at the table for Mass and all sorts of things. But when you get into the Reformed church, after the Reformation, it's all about the printing press. Get people access to God's Word. John Knox establishes free. He says he wants everyone, regardless of their class, to be able to read God's Word. So Monday to Friday, churches are used as schools. And it doesn't matter if you've got no money, you will get free education for your children. Not everybody took it. Some people children still had to work in the farms and things like that. A large number did. And really, Scotland had quite a high literacy rate, education rate compared to other countries in Europe. I think the Netherlands had the best, for what I can remember, but Scotland was pretty high up there. But as you see, Knox there, the first book mass produced is actually after the Bible, was the Book of Psalms for singing. Our denomination is still exclusive psalmody. We just sing psalms only. And that's been a sort of Scottish thing since the Reformation. A lot of the Presbyterian churches, like the Church of Scotland, the sort of national church, they've kind of moved away from psalms. They sing hymns, but we still exclusive psalmody. This is actually the gravestone of one of John Knox's pupils. When George Wishart met him, Knox was a personal tutor. He'd left the Catholic Church and got a job teaching that noble's, that laird's 2 sons. And this is one of them. Yeah, it's called Memorial Brass to Protestant Alexander Coburn of Ormiston. The only silver you would get in churches would be communion cups and baptism things. But this is the book that caused the riot of the Second Reformation. You can see here the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary, St. Matthias Day. So it wasn't that the Scots were objecting to a prayer book, but it was this one, this particular one, which they felt was just very Roman Catholic. A man called Archbishop William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, he was the one behind this, and he believed in the high Anglican ceremonies and traditions and things. So when it's read out for the first time in St Giles, this is what happens. The Archprelate of St Andrews in Scotland, reading the new service book in his pontificalibus, assaulted by men and women with cricket, stools, sticks and stones. So Jenny Geddes threw the first one. Supposedly this is Jenny Geddes' stool that she threw. It started the Second Reformation. The speeches by Alexander Henderson. That National Covenant, when it was signed, it was written by 2 men, as I said, the lawyer who did the legal section in the centre, and Alexander Henderson, who was a minister. He did the part at the bottom that says we will defend ourselves, we're going to live godly lives, we're going to keep Scotland a godly nation, Christ is the head of the church, the king can be the king, but don't interfere in the church. This is his original cap and gown. This pulpit here, from just after the Reformation, now most pulpits were just simple ones like that. That was the one Knox preached on in St Giles, which we'll go over and see in a second. This one's a bit more elaborate. We weren't always as elaborate for this, but this dates from the late 1500s, this pulpit. In pulpits in Scotland after the Reformation, you would always have things like this attached onto them, and people wonder what they are. Most people think it's for candles, for light. We had a Christian school not too long ago on tour, and some of the children thought it was a water bottle holder for the minister. But what it actually is, it's called a sandglass stand. When the minister went in to preach, he had an hourglass. He would turn the hourglass over and the sand would fall through. Now, most people think, well, that's his time limit, 1 hour to preach. That wasn't, that was just the minimum. And it was a way of timing these sermons. You could turn it 2 times, 3 times. And sermons, it says there, you can see here, many sermons lasted 3 hours or more. So that sounds a bit strange to us today, to have a 3 or 4 hour sermon. But people wanted it back then. They're coming from before the Reformation, everything in Latin, all worship services in Latin. No knowledge of what God's word was. To all of a sudden, the Bible being explained to them, being told what it means, and in a language that they could understand. Very few people spoke Latin, so it was a foreign language, it was just words being read out. And they were just so hungry for God's word. They're like, tell us more, we need to learn more. So that's why you get 3-hour sermons. So you can see here, the Covenanters outlawed. 1660, Charles II goes back on the throne. 61, he has the man who put the crown on his head killed. 62, all the Presbyterians are kicked out and told to come under control of the bishops. And this is what they do. They preach out the fields out there. Soldiers were given the power of judge, jury and executioner. They could go out, like John Brown of Priest Hill, a man who used to teach local children in the area Bible stories. He had a little Sunday school in his little cottage, him and his wife. Soldiers came, took him out in front of his wife and children and shot him on the spot. And his grave's still, you can go and visit that grave. Here, little tokens which got little scripture verses on them. And it's a way of, when you're outside there, you don't know who's a spy, who's not a spy. So it's a way of sort of eliminating that. Your own minister would give you a little token that's got like scripture verses and things on it, which shows that you've been examined by your own session. And you could, if it was maybe communion, the Lord's Supper, you could show that and partake in the Lord's Supper as well. So you can see this mask here belonged to a man called Alexander Peden. Alexander Peden was one of the great Covenanter ministers, one of those ministers who preached out in the fields. Huge price on his head. At one point he was arrested, and just off the east coast of Scotland there's a little island called Bass Rock, and the Scottish government in 1670 bought Bass Rock and built a prison on it simply for these Presbyterian ministers. And he was arrested at one point and put on Bass Rock in prison there. But he's released because he's told he's going to be sold to the plantations. He's going to be banished, basically banished to America. But he's put on board the ship. When it gets to London, the captain changes down in London, and when he finds out that this man's who's just been preaching, he lets him go. So he comes straight back up to Scotland, begins preaching again. And there's huge, as I said, huge price on his head. So when he preached with this mask on. This is his original mask. Now it's a bit darker now because it's almost 400 years old, over 300 years old. So when it was a lot more skin coloured back then. Everybody knew it was a mask, the congregation, but from a distance you wouldn't know it was a mask. And he preached with this on. After the service, he rode off, took his mask off. Only his close friends knew exactly what he looked like. So soldiers didn't know who they were looking for, thanks to this mask. Another minister, William Hannay, preaching out in the fields. He fell asleep in a barn one night and he had soldiers approach him. So he fled out the barn, but he left his Bible behind. And when he came back to get it the next morning, he found it here. If you go down this side, you can see where one of them thrust their sword straight through the Bible. So one of them's taken out the sword and just stuck it straight through. It's a Geneva Bible there. Inside that Parliament Hall, this is how people would have been tortured, either with thumb screws, which I'm going to show you in a second, they're inside the museum, or hanged and drowned. We're in tied to the stake. So. Over here you've got two more copies of the National Covenant. That one's for the Privy Council of Edinburgh, so it's got a nice fancy border. This one comes from Dumbarton, which is a district west of Glasgow. And there's a third one behind there. But you can see all these signatures. Well, people signed it. And it was taken to each town. They got their own copy. It was read out in the church and explained, and people could ask questions. And then people invited from that town to come and sign it. And the nation really did flock. It became a national covenant. There's a good number of surviving copies left inside here. This is the Solemn Leaguing Covenant, the agreement to give the English Parliament aid in exchange for church reforms. You've got two banners up here as well, which were both carried. When we get across to Greyfriars Churchyard, I'm going to tell you about a battle. And this was carried by the Presbyterians at a battle called Bothwell Bridge. So you can see here, for God and the covenanted work of Reformation, Jehovah Nissi, God by banner. And over here it says Covenants for Religion, Kings and Kingdoms. So both of them date from the 1600s. And as I said, this is a pulpit, Knox's pulpit from St Giles, where he would preach from. Very plain, very, very plain. So I'll show you something over here as well. So you can see this here, it's called the grading. Now, a lot of people think the French invented the guillotine. It was actually used in Scotland from almost 200 years before the French. Used from about early, I think it was 1500s, 1563 right through to 1710. So most of the Covenanters that were executed, it was by hanging down at the Grassmarket. But if you were a noble or somebody of more high importance, you would get this as a choice. So two reasons for that: it was seen as a bit more humane. Hanging from a rope didn't always die quickly. With this, you've got a solid, heavy weight, razor sharp, heads off in a second. But also for the people watching, it's more of a display because you hold up the severed head and things. The very first martyr of the Second Reformation, the man who put the crown on the king's head, he was beheaded on this, as were others. His son, later on, was beheaded on this as well, so both father and son. This is not a replica, this is the original one, so several martyrs were executed on this. And it folds down, stored away. Over here, we've got the thumb screws, which they used on people to put the thumbs in. Doesn't look like much, but if you've ever hit your thumb with a hammer, then you know that it's extremely painful. People passed out with this. This there. But this, as you can see here, is an act of Parliament. Whoever without licence or authority aforesaid shall preach, expound scripture, or pray at any of these meetings in the field or in any house shall be punished with death. So that's an act passed by the government. So if you were captured with the heart shapers outside St Giles, you were held in prison there, chained up to this is the bar from the prison, and these chains. Then you were taken inside, tortured with that or the book, and then taken down to the Grassmarket and executed. And when we're across at Greyfriars, I want to tell you about a battle. It's called the Battle of Blond Hill Bridge on the 22nd of June 1679, and this is a depiction of the battle.
Yeah.
The remaining
Edinburgh's such an old city.
Yeah.
You know, it's just everywhere you walk, it's like stepping back in time.
Après, surtout les oreilles.
You can cross over here. I'm going to take a photograph because it's just been repaired. So I haven't seen it since it's been repaired. It was closed off just for a couple of weeks. Well, it's needing a bunch of work done. So, as you can see here, it says, on this spot, many martyrs and covenanters died for the Protestant faith. So this is the Grassmarket, one of the busiest parts of the city. This is why this was the place that was chosen for public executions. So if you can imagine a platform about 8 feet high, and top of the platform is the gallows. So many people were hanged. It's a place for criminals as well. But it's where many martyrs were executed as well. Most martyrs were hanged. Just a few were actually had the guillotine, but this is where the gallows stood. So again, you can imagine outside St Giles, held in prison there, tortured in there, the other room, next to Knox's grave, then brought down here, it's called the West Bow, brought down this street here and executed here. So over 100 martyrs were executed at this spot. And you're looking at some of the same buildings that they did. That building here dates back to early 1616, that one there. There's a pub over there called the Last Drop, which is dates back to the early 1600s. It's called the Last Drop because that's where you got your last drop of whiskey before the last drop of the gallows. And you can see the shape of the gallows on the ground here.
Yes.
Just a different type of stone. I'm going to show you this plaque as well. So, this is the names of just the ones that we know of. There's many more that we just don't know the names of them. So you can see here, it says, the following list, though not complete, gives some indication of the number and varied walks of life. So you've got the man who put the crown on the king's head, right here, the Marquis of Argyll, all the way down to young James Renwick in 1688. So, as I said, it's not the full list of everyone who was executed here. But you can see, you've got a Marquis, nobility, Earl, father and son. Before an Earl, you've got a shoemaker. You've got servant girls, ministers, a number of ministers. So you can see it's all walks of life, male and female, rich or poor. If you refused to deny your faith and accept the king as head of the church, this is what would happen to you in Edinburgh. And people come on our tours, and I could take you out for 2 weeks. I could take you out for a full month and go around all the small towns and villages, and you still wouldn't see all the graves that are there. There's basically not a town or a village, and especially in the southwest of Scotland, doesn't have at least one martyr in it connected to it. And they're in the middle of fields, next to rivers and all sorts of things. Donald Cargill, where is he? Here's 1681, Donald Cargill. There. I just want to give you an example just of their faith, because when he comes down here, he stands here, Donald Cargill, the minister, stands here looking up at the ladder, and he's got a smile on his face. And the hangman says, "Why are you smiling? You know you're going to be hanged." And Donald Cargill says, "Smiling," says, "because to go up this ladder means nothing to me." He says, "I will go up this ladder with less fear than any time I've ever stepped into a pulpit to preach." He says, "But to go up this ladder, that's nothing. Preaching God's word, the responsibility, that terrified me. But going up this ladder's nothing." And there was a young 18-year-old boy who witnessed this, and he goes off, and such an impact on him, this man's execution, that he goes off and trains for the ministry himself, and he becomes a full preacher. He becomes the last to die here, James Renwick. He was only 25 when he was executed. But he was 18 when he saw Donald Cargill being executed. He goes off and trains for the ministry himself. He couldn't train for the ministry in Scotland. He had to go over to the Netherlands. There was an exiled Church of Scotland over there. So we're going to see what happens now after they've been executed. Yeah. I'm going to take you around to the mass grave. You'll see this. I'll read this to you. What it says. It says, "Halt, passenger, take heed what you do see. This tomb does show for what some men did die. Here lies interred the dust of those who stood against perjury, resisting unto blood, adhering to the covenants and laws, establishing the same which was the cause. Their lives were sacrificed, unto the lusts of prelators subdued. Though here the dust lies mixed with murderers and other crew, whom justice justly did to death pursue. But as for them, no cause was to be found worthy of death, but only they were found constant and steadfast, zealous witnessing for the prerogatives of Christ their King, which truths were sealed by famous Guthrie's head, and all along to Mr. Renwick's blood. They did endure the wrath of enemies, reproaches, torments, deaths and injuries, but yet they're those who from such trouble came, and now triumph in glory with the Lamb."
Wow.
You can see here, the man who put the crown on the king's head at the bottom, Marquis of Argyll, was beheaded to the 17th of February 1688, and Mr. James Renwick suffered, were one way or other murdered and destroyed for the same cause, about 18,000, of whom were executed at Edinburgh, about 100 noblemen, gentlemen, ministers and other noble martyrs for Jesus Christ. The most of them lie here. So, over 100 here that we know of. There's others whose names we don't know, so there's many more. This is just a mass grave.
Yeah.
This is the part of the cemetery that was set aside for criminals, which is why it says here, though their dust lies mixed with murderers and other crew, whom justice justly did to death pursue. But as for them, no cause was to be found worthy of death. The government saw them as criminals. Now, it could be a Bible study in your house, it could be a prayer meeting with some friends, listening to the gospel being preached out in the field. That was enough to have you arrested during this second Reformation and executed and placed inside here. So it is a mass grave we've got here. You've got a quote from Revelation there, sandstone, so was getting a bit worn away, so it's just the same quote here on the brass plate. It's called the Martyrs Monument. Over 100.
And remind me, what year was this?
This is from
61.
61, made it right through to 68.
So, yeah.
27 years of persecution. And you see, throughout Scotland, 18,000. Executed at Edinburgh, 100. So, sad. The blossoms come down the trees. That's a good sign. Take a picture up for my wife. Nothing's here. We've got a really good website the church built. It's called the Long Reformation because it started with Patrick Hamilton in 1528 and wasn't completed till 1688. So 160 years, you know, a struggle for Reformation. Just cut across the ground a bit. Just going to show you this one over here. It's unusual to see that type here. Don't know if you've ever heard of this man, George Buchanan.
No.
George Buchanan is one of Scotland's great reformers. Not as well known as people like John Knox and others, but he really helped the Reformation in Scotland. Grew up in a relatively poor family. His father died young, but his uncle had some money, and he saw some potential in George, education. He was a smart child, so he sent him off to some of the top universities on the continent to train, and he.
Oh, he's the one that sold the books.
Yeah, he might have done.
And so. Then they had to send them new ones.
Possibly.
Oh, anyway, yeah.
But he was a smart guy. He ended up becoming. He was known as the smartest. Well, one of the quotes was, "George Buchanan is the smartest man that Scotland's ever produced," and that was a quote from an Englishman. So he must have been pretty smart for someone from England to say that about him at that time. But he ends up becoming the tutor to noblemen and to even the king. But he goes over to the continent and he starts to teach at some of the top universities there as well. And he goes to Portugal, to one of the universities there. And obviously by this time he's a Protestant. So he comes under the suspicion of an inquisition and he's arrested. And he's not tortured, but he's sent to a monastery for quite a long time to basically, as punishment, to go to a monastery. But he's released and he comes back to Scotland. When he comes back to Scotland, the Reformation's just happened. So just after 1560, he comes back. But there was a real emergency situation in Scotland because once they kicked the French out, the nation, it was pretty quick in the end. The whole nation changed and became a Protestant country with Knox as a leader. There was only 6 Protestant ministers in the whole of Scotland. It's not enough to do anything. So they had to train men for the ministry pretty quickly. They had to get organised as well. And this was George Buchanan had a big impact inside that. Now, the year after the Reformation, Mary Queen of Scots returns, as I said, and she moves into Holyrood. John Knox, as I said, would go down and meet with her. It would usually end up a fight. George Buchanan spoke fluent French, and Mary Queen of Scots had grown up in France. Mother sent her over there. So he went down and would meet with her, and he would converse. And they weren't friends, but she respected him, and he had a kind of respect for her. But after she had her husband killed and she was forced to abdicate, he says, "Look, I can't help you." So she's forced to abdicate. King James becomes king at just 1 year of age, and he's handed over to this guy, and he becomes the king's personal tutor. You want the smartest man in Scotland to teach the king, and he raises the king and educates him. Now, even as the king was getting older, he was apparently a very arrogant child. And George Buchanan's normally calm, but one day I think the king was about 9 or 10, he said something really inappropriate in the class, and George Buchanan put his book down, bent over, grabbed the king by the scruff of the neck, put him over his knee and began to smack the king. Of course the king's screaming, "Help, help, help," and the ladies in waiting burst in. They're like, "What are you doing? How dare you lay your hands on the Lord's anointed one?" And George Buchanan says, "Stop smacking the king." He says, "Madam, you go about your business, I'll go about my business," and continued smacking the king. So sometimes even the king needs a smack. But sadly, modern historians have tried to paint him as a strict disciplinarian because of that incident with the king. But he's actually quite a funny guy. He wrote books on practical jokes to play on your friends, and he used to write poetry poking fun at nobles and leaders. This here, Alexander Henderson. When the National Covenant was written, it was written by 2 men, the lawyer, Archibald Johnson, and Minister Alexander Henderson. Alexander Henderson, initially, there's a little village called Lookers up near St Andrews, just a small village. And early 1600s, the kings forced bishops on the church, so it looks like we're moving back to Rome, and people are really, really concerned about it, causes all sorts of trouble. He trains as an Episcopal minister, and he's sent to the little village of Lookers. And when he gets there, the people don't want him because they're all Presbyterian. So they lock the church door and he can't get in. So, obviously can't get in. So what he does is he walks around, finds an open window, climbs in the window. But people don't come to hear him preach because they're going to a Presbyterian minister nearby, a minister called the Reverend Robert Bruce. So he wonders what all the fuss is. and he disguises himself as a little country person, sneaks into this church to be this Presbyterian minister's preaching, and he's trying to hide up the back, but hoping not to be seen. But the minister sees him coming in and instantly recognises him, and because he changes what he's going to preach on that day, he changes it to the start of John 10. It says that anyone who enters the sheepfold by any other way than through the door, that man's a thief and a robber. And he remembers how he climbed in the window of the church, and it's almost as if he says that's the minute God spoke to me. He says even though I was an Episcopal Anglican minister, he says that's when God spoke to me through that sermon. And he becomes a Presbyterian minister, settles down to life in that little village. The people come to hear him and becomes a faithful minister for over 20 years. Then Jenny Geddes starts the Second Reformation, throws the stool because of the prayer books. People need a leader to come and lead them. They need someone like John Knox. You know, they know that this is another swan. They know that this is we need another strong leader for the Reformation, and this man steps up, and he becomes the minister of St Giles. He becomes the moderator of the first free General Assembly for 36 years, which is held in Glasgow Cathedral, where they get rid of all the things that the king's forced in the church, all the bishops, all the ceremonies, the prayer books. The king's advisor, representative in Scotland, the Duke of Hamilton, bursts in and he says this is an illegal assembly. You don't meet with the king's authority. And Alexander Henderson says, go tell the king we meet under the authority of a higher king, King Jesus. And of course the king's representative was kicked out. He goes down to England, and as I said, our church and a lot of Presbyterian churches use the Westminster Confession of Faith. He was very influential on that. And when he's down in England in the 1640s, he starts to feel unwell, and he comes back up to Scotland and dies in there. Dies in 1647, and he's buried here. This is his grave. When Charles II, a few years later, when Charles II comes on the throne in 1660, he begins to round up all these leading church leaders for execution. First one being the man who put the crown on the king's head. He's obviously dead, so you can't arrest him. So soldiers are told to destroy his grave. So you can see musket ball holes where they've came and shot their muskets at his grave. And if you come round here, you can see where they've tried to use their swords to sort of deface it. Now they were told to destroy it. So it's a bit of a half-hearted attempt. I think probably thought to themselves we're just blunting their swords and wasting ammunition. You can see a little plaque here. And just tells you he was a minister at Lookers. Henderson wrote one of the 3 sections of the National Covenant, and was moderator of the General Assembly, main author of the Solemn League and Covenant, and he's one of the Scottish Commissioners to the Westminster Assembly. One of his friends and fellow minister when he died, Robert Bailey, said that Henderson ought to be accounted by us in posterity the fairest ornament after John Knox of incomparable memory that ever the Church of Scotland did enjoy. So he's the John Knox of the Second Reformation, the church leader. Very, very important man. So there's a group over there, but you can see the gates just behind them. Just behind it. That's a walled off section of the churchyard over there. And 1679 was an important year through all this struggle. About 400 to 500 people were worshipping at an on the 1st of June 1679, worshipping at an outdoor worship service. Illegal, shouldn't be doing it. But soldiers come and attack it. And the Covenanters always believed, these Presbyterians in Scotland have always believed in the right of self-defence. We don't have a right to go out and take a man's life, but if we're attacked, we can defend ourselves. So quite often when they had these worship services, they would bring weapons with them for self-defence. So when the soldiers came and attacked them on the 1st of June 1679, they put up a defence and defeated the soldiers. Now, it wasn't a big battle. There was only about 10 of the people killed, 10 of the worshippers killed, but there was about 30 to 40 soldiers killed. And they thought to themselves, this is maybe a good time to stand up to the king. We've got people being shot in the fields, hanged, drowned, tortured, banished, imprisoned, all over the place. We need to tell the king we're not going to take it anymore. So they were a bit high on the victory that they got at that little skirmish, that they decided we'll march on Edinburgh. And more people came and joined them. And for the next 3 weeks, the numbers swelled to about 3,000 people. Now, they're not soldiers, they're just farmers mostly. They're shepherds, weavers, farmers. They've got some weapons, they've got some horse, they've got one cannon that they managed to procure from somewhere. But as I said, they weren't trained soldiers. So there's a place called Hamilton, and there's a bridge called Bothwell Bridge next to it over the River Clyde. And these people stayed there for those 3 weeks. Now, they were not sure what they were going to do next. They didn't know. Some of them wanted to go to Edinburgh, some of them wanted to go to Glasgow. There was a lot of squabbling amongst themselves. But what the king did was he sent 15,000 professional troops to come and crush what he saw as a rebellion. So 3,000 Presbyterians, mainly farmers, 15,000 battle-hardened troops on the other side of the bridge. They tried to hold the bridge as best as they could, but once the soldiers got over it was just a slaughter. The official number's 400 killed in the battle, but probably a lot more than that. 1,200 were captured, brought through to Edinburgh, and there was no prison big enough to hold 1,200 people, so they put them behind these gates. They came known as the Covenanters prison inside here, and they were here for more than almost 5 months, just about 5 months. They were there from June till November 1679. But you can see here, each man was allowed 4 ounces of bread a day, which is not enough to survive on. Quite often they didn't even get that. The guards took it. Some of the prisoners died here, some were tried and executed for treason, some escaped, and some were freed after signing a bond of loyalty to the king. At the end of that 5 months, as I said, people died of starvation, exposure to the weather, taken out and executed, all sorts. By November, there was only 257 men remaining inside here, and they were sold to Barbados, to one of the plantations, as slaves, which is a bit of history a lot of people don't know about, as the Scots being sold as slaves. So they were taken down, put on board the ship down at Leith, the docks, and they were going to be transported across the Atlantic. But as the ship was going round, it set sail after a few days. It got round the north coast of Scotland. It got caught in a storm and began to drift towards the rocks of the Orkney Islands. The captain knew the ship was going to sink, hit the rocks, so he said to the sailors, "Abandon ship." He said, "But make sure you nail down the hatches. We don't want the cargo escaping." The cargo being these 257 men. So the sailors nailed down the hatches and they got off. Now, eventually the ship did smash against the rocks and a hole appeared in the hull of the ship. Some of the Covenanters managed to escape out, but over 200 drowned on board that shipwreck. So only 48 of the prisoners survived. And when you go up to the Orkney Islands, on top of the cliffs where the shipwreck happened, there's a huge monument there to those who drowned. And it's about the height of that building. It's a huge monument. But this is basically a concentration camp for God's people who were kept behind here for 5 months. No shelter, nothing. Now known as the Covenanter prison. We'll just head down with it. Basic clothes on it. And even Scotland's, in the summertime it's not too bad. But when you get to like October, November, it's cold. And wind and rain. A lot of famous people here. This was Charles II's doctor. He's buried in there. Obviously you had to be wealthy to get a big crypt like that. So I'm just going to show you this sign over here first. See, it says in Greyfriars the National Covenant was adopted and signed the 28th of February 1638. It says in the Kirklands for Objects of Historical Things. So you've obviously got the mass grave of Covenant, down there, the mass grave that you saw. You've got the prison where many of them are held. You've got reformers, Alexander Henderson, all those guys. So this is central. Look like a wee factory.
Yeah.
She's talking. We've got an etiquette. You don't talk in front of too close to other tour guides. So Greyfriars Churchyard's central to the Reformation. Not quite as much as St Giles as when you saw there was a lot in St Giles, but here it's an important place in the city. It's called Greyfriars because there was an order of Greyfriars monks. I think they were Franciscans or Augustinians. I can't remember, but they were before the Reformation. They lived here and worshipped here. So after the Reformation, it still kept the name Greyfriars. Now they built a new church, you can see, in 1614, because after the Reformation, before the Reformation, Protestants were persecuted, burned at the stake, and all sorts. After the Reformation, people weren't forced to convert. You could still remain a Catholic, and these monks were allowed to stay here as long as they didn't go out and actively try and promote the Catholic faith. They just lived here and did what they did. Then there was no problem. So they were left here, and the last one didn't die till just early 1600s. So that's where it became Protestant place of worship. They built a new church, and it became Protestant. Most people, when they come in here, you maybe saw a statue of a dog outside, across the road. Greyfriars Bobby, it's a little dog. We've got Bobby's bar there, Bobby's sandwich bar round the corner, the dog's grave that they're sitting on. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Greyfriars Bobby. It's a little dog that came with his master. Came with his master in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and his master died. His master was just a poor shepherd, but the dog, because of its loyalty to its master, he was buried down there, his owner. But the dog always sat in his master's grave, so the grave digger would throw the dog out, and it always found a way in. It would always just sit there. So it became famous in the city for its loyalty to its master, even in death. It got the freedom of the city. It got Queen Victoria came to see the little dog. Walt Disney made a movie about the dogs. You can watch the Disney movie Greyfriars Bobby. So most people, when they come in here, that's where they go straight to, is Greyfriars Bobby, the dog's grave. But what they completely miss the Reformation connections to this, because this is where the National Covenant was signed. 60,000 people flooded into the city to come and witness it. Once they come up with that final draft, they brought it here, read it inside the church, brought it outside for the people, and you can imagine thousands of people filling this churchyard just to hear it being read and then signing it. One witness said that people were in tears when they signed it, described it as that great marriage day between Scotland and God, when we as a nation bound ourselves in covenant with the Lord. And they're so huge thing in Scotland's Reformation history. You've also got mass grave down there, you've got the prison, you've got reformers buried, George Buchanan, Alexander Henderson. So there's a huge amount of connections to the Reformation here in Greyfriars. But very sadly, a lot of people come in and focus on that dog. I'm going to tell you how all this Reformation ended. So he started off away with Patrick Hamilton in 1528. Knox, George Wishart, others. Knox coming to the forefront, leading the nation in the first part of the Reformation. Knox dies, and it looks like all the work's about to be undone because the kings want to try and change the church. James VI, when he grew up, as I said, tried to force the church to be Anglican because he wanted power. Brought him into conflict with the church, obviously. A church minister called Andrew Melville very famously met with the king up at Falkland and grabbed the king by his sleeve and says, "Your Majesty, you're God's silly vassal. Do you not realise there's two kings and two kingdoms in Scotland? There's King James's kingdom, where you're the head and we're your subjects, but there's also King Jesus' kingdom in Scotland, where you're a subject just the same as us." And the king's obviously furious, says, "Who gives you authority to speak to me like this?" And Andrew Melville slams his Bible down and says, "This is my authority, God's word." So 1603, however, Andrew Melville was eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London and banished. 1603, King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, pushes all this church reforms in it. Charles II, when he takes over, his wife, Henrietta Maria, is Roman Catholic. So people really think this is it. We're moving back to Rome. It's not just about the king having power now. We know that there's communication between the Pope and Charles I through his wife Henrietta Maria. So it leads to prayer book riots, and then all this persecution that you saw here that lasted right through to 1688. Charles II, who's doing most of the persecution, dies in 1685, and his devoutly Roman Catholic brother, James VII of Scotland, or the Second of England, he takes over. And James VII is openly Roman Catholic. Charles II said he wasn't Roman Catholic, he said he was Anglican, but he asked for his best friend, who was a Jesuit priest, to come and give him the last rites on his deathbed. So he was a Catholic, closet Catholic. His brother, James VII, is openly Roman Catholic, makes no issue of it being public. So people are concerned because he starts to promote Roman Catholics to prominent positions in the government, and he starts a Jesuit college down at Holyrood Palace and causes all sorts of trouble. Even down in England, people don't want him because of this. So an invitation is sent over to his daughter, Mary, who's married to William of Orange over in the Netherlands. So they say to them, we don't like your father and your father-in-law. We want to offer you the throne because they're Protestants. So they accept. And his son-in-law, William of Orange, lands in the 5th of November 1688 in the south of England with a Protestant army, begins to make his way towards London. James VII panics and flees out of London, and the throne's declared vacant. He goes over to France, the throne's declared vacant, and it's known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. William and Mary march in to London, great fanfare, and they become King and Queen of England. Up in Scotland, we don't offer them the crown straight away. We say, look, we've had all this persecution for all these years. We will accept you as King and Queen, but only if you keep the church in Scotland Presbyterian. And that's when that law, they agree, so that's fine. So they say, because the people in Scotland say, we will never accept anyone but Christ as head of the church. We'll accept you as king, but not in the church. So that's when they agree, and this clause, this law is passed, that since then, any future monarch, they have to come and they have to sign that thing that you saw Charles the Third signing, says promising not to interfere in the independent Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And that's when the persecution ends, with William and Mary coming, because they obviously let the church be Presbyterian, and the people can worship the way that they see God's word tells them to worship, without the ceremonies and the king's troops hunting them down and things. So that's Scotland's Reformation.
Yeah.
In Edinburgh, the parts you can see in Edinburgh. If you ever make up to St Andrews, there's lots of stuff there to see as well. So you've got 160 years. Patrick Hamilton in 1528 through to William and Mary coming in 1688, and you've got 160 years of Reformation. So I hope you've enjoyed that too. So what to take? If you go away and you've got any questions, just send me an email.
Where is the Presbyterian Church, or you say Protestantism, in Scotland today? Where do you feel things are?
It's not in a great way at the minute, although there is signs of it's improving. The more reformed churches are doing well. The liberal churches not doing so great. The liberal Presbyterian churches are not doing great. They're losing a lot of their buildings, I see. But the more reformed churches seem to be holding their own. We've got a church plant right now, which we've got one in Edinburgh, which became a full congregation. We've got another one we're opening up in Wishaw. We've got monthly services that we're having there, and we're getting a good amount of people from the communities coming there. So hopefully that'll, by God's grace, that'll be a full-time church as well. So, and we've started Christian schools.
you.